Testament came about because we were doing a Sabbath school. I was about to teach a Sabbath school, and we were covering the word love in the Old Testament. And when we look at the Old Testament compared to the New Testament, we see that a lot of times that the Old Testament seems to be like a mean God, a genocidal God. And the New Testament, or the New Covenant, reveals the true love of God. And so I was trying to really uncover the word love in the Old Testament. Where is it? You don't see it very often. So if you have a King James Bible, it's hidden. It's in the word mercy. It's in the word kindness. It appears over 150 times in the Old Testament. And the word is called hesed love, or in Hebrew, it's chesed love. And hesed love is similar to agape love. It's unconditional love, but they view it as a steadfast love. It's a really different dimension than the New Testament, which I thought was really interesting. So if you could put the slide on, the next slide displayed. Is it appearing? Does that not come up, Ken? Oh, okay. I don't have many slides, but the slide is going to show you a book, and it's called A Loving Life. And I just wanted to show you this. And the reason why it's important to me is because Paul E. Miller, who is a Presbyterian, he wrote this book. And he wrote another book, Love Walked Among Us. It's on the Gospels. And what's interesting is that when I was doing the study on Hesed love, I saw a little video clip of this man. And it was just a 2-minute video clip. And I thought, wow, it was so profound. It just had an impact upon me. And I said to myself, I wonder if he's written any books. And sure enough, he had written a book called A Loving Life. And it was on the book of Ruth. Of all things, I wouldn't expect to find the word love in the Old Testament in a book with only 4 chapters. But after reading his book, it was so profound that truly, now we have Psalms, we have Song of Solomon, but truly this book of 4 chapters really defined love in the Old Testament like no other book did. It really defined, and I wouldn't, when we think about the book of Ruth, we think about the kinsman redeemer, Boaz, and things like that, but we don't really pick up the nuances of this book. And if that's not working, I can bring my laptop up here because I got a couple more slides. Would that be better? Okay, let me just walk down here for a second real quick. It was working here a minute ago. I'm gonna try to fix it. Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It was working a minute ago, actually, when we put it up. And I don't know why we can't get to the next slide, but anyways, as they are fixing that, Hesed love in the book of Ruth and in the Old Testament is a determination of the will to love despite. Okay, it's a determination of the will to despite how others treat you or how others feel towards you. So this is steadfast love, just as it says. And it also is a determination of the will despite how you feel towards other people. Okay, so when you look at the Old Testament as a whole, okay, that really this Hesed love is really displaying God's love throughout the whole Old Testament, because he still loved not based upon how he felt towards other people. Thank goodness for that, right? Or how how others treated him, okay, which was very unfair, even in the Old Testament. And it wasn't based upon how he felt towards others. He was not getting his feelings towards him or them towards him to affect how this Hesed love would work. And so when we look at Hesed love in the book of Ruth, it's love in the book of Ruth is the idea of God's love towards us. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward here. The greatest barrier to love is ourselves. Okay, the greatest barrier to love other people is ourselves. Why? Because so many times we look at other people and we contrast them to who we are. Okay, so it really deflates this love. So really, love collapses judgment, whereas judgment will collapse love. They're mutually exclusive. If I love a person, I can't be judging them if I'm loving them. Does that make sense? And if I'm judging a person, I can't love them if I'm judging them. And here's the book, I think it's up now. It's called A Loving Life by Paul E. Miller. I recommend anybody getting it. I've read it twice, and it was hard not to cry when I was reading it, even the second time. It was just so powerful. And it's all about this love. So when we look at it, and it's interesting because Ruth is a woman, and obviously, right? Naomi is a woman as well. But women in the Old Testament did not get the respect. Even in the New Testament, during Jesus's time, they didn't get any respect. But it's interesting, if you read Matthew 1, the chronology of Jesus, you'll see 4 women. The first one is Tamar. And if you know the history of Tamar in Genesis, I believe it's 28. And that I'm not going to go through that Judah and Tamar, but it's interesting. It's nudged right in there in the story of Joseph. It's in between. And anyway, she was a Canaanite. She is part of Jesus's chronology. Okay, Tamar, a Canaanite. Rahab is the next person, who's another Canaanite. Okay, she is part of this chronology that through David and Jesse. The third is Ruth, who we'll be looking at today, and she was a Moabite. Okay, she is part of the chronology of Jesus. And the fourth is Bathsheba, who is a Hittite, and she is also a part of this chronology. It's beautiful because God is inclusive. He's not exclusive. He brings other people, not only women, but also women from other countries into this chronology. So we're going to take a look at the next slide. Can you pull up the next slide? Great. Okay. So we're looking at the chronology here of some people, and not only people, but the words that we need to have as a definition in the book of Ruth before we go forward. We're going to see that the word Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the house of bread. Okay. And when we look at the book of Ruth, it's the first verse of the first chapter. There is a famine in the house of bread. Doesn't that sound kind of ironic? How can there be a famine in the house of bread? There's no bread in the house, I guess. But anyways, that's how the book of Ruth unfolds. The second word is Elimelech. I can't pronounce that correctly. I've done it once before, and this was Naomi's husband's name. And it means my God is king. The third one is Naomi, and Naomi means pleasant in Hebrew. Now, Naomi had 2 sons, remember, that died. One was married to Orpah, one was married to Ruth. And their son's name was Mahlon, which is weak, and Chilion, which is frail. Isn't it interesting? Why would you name your kids weak and frail? Okay, maybe they were weak and frail when she gave birth to them, but you don't want to call them weak and frail all their life, because what a name to go through in life, called weak and frail. Here's my brother weak, here's my brother frail, you know. We use these Hebrew words because we don't know the meanings to them, but meanings meant a lot behind a name in Hebrew. Now, the word Ruth means friendship, and Boaz means pillar. And that's crucial to understand the story of Ruth. So let's take a look in Ruth chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. And we're going to take a look at that. Naomi asks God to bless Ruth and Orpah. And we're going to take a look at this dialogue, this exchange. Okay. Let me try the International Standard Version. This is chapter 1, verse 8 and 9. But along the way, Naomi told her two daughters-in-law, each of you go back home, return to your mother's house. May the Lord show his gracious love to you, as you have shown me and our loved ones who have died. May the Lord grant each of you security in your new husbands' households. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they cried out loudly. And so in that was the International Standard Version. The King James in verse, let's see, I think it's in, verse 8. Let me read that again. Naomi said unto her two daughters-in-law, go return each to your mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you. That's the word hesed. So what Ruth is saying, or Naomi is saying to her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, she is saying this. She's saying, I pray that God will give hesed love to you, a steadfast love that you find new husbands, a steadfast love that you go back to your land, because you don't want to be hanging out with me. I'm nothing but a curse. My husband dies. Both of your husbands die, which are my two sons. So what we see here is that the aspect of this love, this hesed love, is that it combines sacrifice with commitment. Okay, sacrifice with commitment are combined in one word, hesed love. And it's also a one-way love. So this love does not look back. You know, Paul says, don't look back. You look forward, right? Hesed love is a one-way love. There is no exit strategy with hesed love. So Naomi's trying to bless Ruth and Orpah that this is the only way you have to go. You got to go back. Okay. Go back, find new husbands. So the interesting thing about this hesed love, it's an opposite love. It acts on the commitments or principles. Okay. It doesn't act on how we feel at the time. It doesn't act on our situation. It doesn't act upon our consequences in our lives. So the response mechanism through hesed love is to act upon a commitment and a principle. Okay, a commitment and principle. In Naomi's mind, you don't want to be with me. Okay, you don't want to be with me. Our behaviors and our feelings don't have control us, don't have to control us. They shouldn't define us. So hesed love is not being controlled by how we feel. Either should agape love. It's not defining who I am. Okay, I might feel bad, but do I have to act bad? You see, the questions on agape love and hesed love especially are something that is on a principle level and not on our consequences or situations that we're in. So hesed love never focuses on fairness. That's why it resets quickly. So hesed love, like agape love, says, this isn't fair. It doesn't act like that. It resets itself. Let's go forward. That's this Romans 8:28. All things will work together to God. If I focus in on the negative of the Romans 8:28 situation, there is no way that I can see God working out good out of a bad situation. And that's what is happening here in Ruth, in her story, in her life. Because she goes beyond that. So hesed love, this agape love in the Old Testament called hesed love, binds itself to the object of love. So Ruth's object of love was Naomi. She lost her husband. She didn't want to go back. She is binding herself to Naomi. Okay. So no matter what the response, She is binding it. We see Ruth gives this hesed back to love to Naomi, and she won't let go. Let's take a look at that in verse 16 of chapter 1. 1:16. I'm going back to the ISV version. 1:16. And I'll read 15 as well. Naomi told Ruth, look, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law, which is Orpah. But Ruth answered, stop urging me to abandon you and to turn back from following you, because wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where I die, where you die, I'm going to die. This is this commitment of hesed love that Ruth has towards Naomi. Naomi is trying to push her away, but she's not having anything to do with it. Ruth sees this as a principle. She's not going back. She's going forward. And she doesn't know where that forward leads either. So we see Ruth give hesed, this love, back to Naomi. Naomi is saying, I don't have any love for you. But Ruth is saying, I have love for you. You see, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. And so we have this contrast between a Jewish person who is Naomi, who should understand the love of God and has this God of great God. And we have this Moabite woman, the daughter-in-law of Ruth, daughter-in-law of Naomi, Ruth, okay, actually living the principles of love out towards Naomi. It's kind of ironic. So when we look at this, each poem stanza that reflects Ruth's hesed love to Naomi, she is saying, where you go, I will go. She is counteracting God's love. Ruth is counteracting God's love to Naomi on a very deep, beautiful level. So Ruth puts God at the center of her love. So for Naomi, it mirrors her heart for Naomi. It's interesting. In other words, what I'm saying is this. Naomi felt that the best thing that she could do for Ruth would be to go back. Okay, because I'm cursed, but I have love for you, Ruth. Naomi says, go back to your people. But Ruth is saying, no, my love is stronger than that. My love towards you is stronger than to go back for you tell me that love is because I want to be where you are at. She must have fell in love with Naomi in some degree, that she would just say that and not go back like Orpah. Even Orpah had a hard time to want to go back, but she did succumb. So let's take a look in verse 18 of this same chapter. When Naomi realized Ruth wanted to go with her, she stopped trying to dissuade her. It says, when Naomi observed Ruth's determination, in Hebrew, that word determination means steadfastness. Okay? Steadfastness. When Naomi saw that she was going to go with her, she ended the conversation. She was not going to try to push Ruth away anymore. God knew that Naomi needed Ruth. And why? Because Ruth is going to show you the picture of God to Naomi. It's really beautiful. It's working on opposites again. So God knew that Naomi needed Ruth. Death to self was the center of Ruth's hesed love. Think about that for a second. You're going to a country where you don't know where you're going. You're going to worship a God that you don't really know. Okay. You are going with a woman who's already been cursed of God by Naomi's understanding of who God was, right? So what we're seeing that she's saying, I have nowhere to go. Ruth says, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to die to self, and wherever you go, I go. Whatever God you worship, I will worship. So God has bound hesed love and into Ruth, and he's bound it into us. Let's take a look at Jeremiah 31, verse 3. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 3. And the whole idea is to get you a different picture of this book of Ruth. So God says to Israel, the Lord appeared to Israel from far away, and he said, I have loved you with an everlasting love. That's hesed love in Hebrew. This everlasting, steadfast love. I've loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I've drawn you with gracious love. So the principle behind Hesed love is that if it's everlasting, if it's steadfast, it will draw in other people. Does that make sense? And we can't produce this love of ourselves. It only comes from God. So it's only to the degree that God is in me that it will give me God's love to draw other people. Does that make sense? God does Hesed love through Ruth to Naomi, as Ruth is God's answer to Naomi's lament. So Naomi would have never figured out that God needed Ruth in her life. She would never figure that out. So God was working through Ruth to get into Naomi's life to show God is good. Isn't that interesting? Because it's opposite. Again, it's like a Gentile telling the true picture of God to a Jew, right? That's what's happening here. So Ruth fights this embrace. Ruth fights, but embraces Naomi's suffering and loss. She becomes a living sacrifice to Naomi's pain. And in verse 19 and 20, they return to Bethlehem during the barley harvest. And people say, and I don't have to go there, but when you get a chance to read that, people say, is this Naomi? Remember her name? Pleasant? Is this pleasant? Don't call me Naomi, she says. Don't call me pleasant, but Mara, bitter. I'm bitter because of what happened and how God treated me. Well, she's coming back with Ruth, and that's going to all change. That's all going to change. And you have to understand one thing about the Jewish understanding. Like the rich man and Lazarus, okay? The Jews looked at the rich man as blessed by God. Lazarus was cursed by God. All right. Jesus turned that whole parable upside down. It was the opposite. That's what's happening here. The Jewish people in the town, when Naomi and Ruth come in at the front entrance to Bethlehem, they're looking like, oh, she's lost her two sons. Why do you call her pleasant? And she says, you're right. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter, which means bitter. So she's going through this. But like Job, Naomi interprets God through the lens of her suffering. Okay. So this mindset of Naomi is that God has pronounced the suffering on me, I will suffer. And that's how I view God. That's how Job started to view God as well. By the time you get to chapter 34, 35, he's really very upset with God. So Hesed love pretends everything isn't rosy. Okay, it's not that type of love. In fact, it isn't Hesed love that sets its will to love. The response of the one loved motivates to love back. Does that make sense? Again, Hesed love does not act on how I feel towards other people. It's not how people feel towards me. It is a principle and a commitment at a high level. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, this Hebrews saw life not as a linear line, okay? They saw it as a J curve, okay? And it's not trapped. So this J curve is not trapped by a cycle of despair, okay? If you see this illustration here, you'll see that here's your normal life. This was Naomi going with her husband and her two sons. This was Naomi's lowest point. Her husband dies, her two sons die. Where do you think the resurrection starts to come? Anybody want to guess? It's when Ruth connects with Naomi and goes back to Bethlehem. That starts Naomi's resurrection. And that's how Jewish people looked at life, this J curve. You're going to be at a certain spot, but you'll hit bottom. But guess what? There's hope. There's hope. And Naomi didn't think Ruth would be her hope, but Ruth was her hope. So let's take a look at chapter 2. Boaz is introduced. Okay, remember his name? He's a pillar. Boaz is a pillar. He's strong. And when we think of a pillar, we think of a temple where the lamb was tied to the temple on this pillar. Okay, so he is a type of Christ that we're presenting here. So in verse 5, let's take a look at chapter 2, verse 5 of Ruth. And we have to get our thinking caps. I know it's kind of heavy, but there's such a blessing in this. Ruth chapter 2, verse 5. It says, at this point, Boaz asked the foreman of the harvesters, to whom does this young woman belong? Who is this young woman, he's asking? Okay. So it's interesting that Boaz, being Jesus, is kind of like this Jesus. He's noticing this woman isn't from Israel. She's not from Bethlehem. She's a foreigner. Okay. So we want to go to the next slide here, which brings in this very interesting position. I'm going to have to walk over here because I don't have it up here. So here is a ranking of social statuses during the time of the judges. This is the time of the judges when the book of Ruth was written. You had a king, judge, they're at the top, tribal leaders, clan leaders. Here is Boaz's position. He's the clan subgroup leader, number 4. All right, older father, Elimelech, okay, eldest son, wife. Here's Naomi's position in the social status. You had a daughter, you had a male servant. Now we're getting into servants or slaves. Female servant, a female servant from a lower class, a resident alien, a male foreigner, and look at where Ruth's status is. She's at the bottom. She is a female foreigner at the lowest, not even a servant. So you have Boaz near the top, and you have Ruth basically at the bottom. So what is Ruth's status? She's a female foreigner. Nobody knows her lineage. She has no family, right? Because she's linking up with Naomi. Her presence is a single female foreigner with unrespect. There's no respect for a person like this. Okay, no respect at all. But Boaz notices her. That's the beauty of God reaching down to take care of the lowliest. Okay. So this Hesed carried risk with it. Ruth knew she was at risk if she followed Naomi back to Bethlehem. And what risk? This was the time of the judges, remember. What was the time of the judges? It was, if you read the first chapter of Judges, every man did whatever was right in his own eyes. It was a dark time. Okay, it was a dark time. Ruth breaks the mold and moves in face of evil. So she creates a risk and vulnerability. She doesn't know anything about Naomi's family, except for her son that she married, but she doesn't know anything about Bethlehem and the Jewish rites and what would happen to her. So she breaks this mold and she says, I'm going forward. There's risk. I'm vulnerable in this risk, but I'm going to go forward. And let's take a look now at verse 11. This picture of Boaz emerges out even stronger. It says, Boaz answered her, and this is chapter 2, verse 11. Boaz answered her, it has been clearly disclosed to me all that you have done. For your mother-in-law, following the death of your husband, how you abandoned your father, your mother, and your own land, and came to a people you did not previously know. Okay, so Boaz knows Ruth's story. It's kind of like God knowing all of our stories. We all have backstories, right? Everybody sitting here has something about them that the person may not know next to you about. And this is the beauty about Boaz. He's coming to Ruth to understand, what is your backstory? I want to know. Okay, and I think the fact that he just recognizes is huge to begin with. That Boaz recognizes Ruth is not part of his clan. It's really Ruth's courage to break social barriers and cultural barriers, despite the situation of Naomi's loss and her own husband, right, at that time. So because of this, Boaz blesses Ruth. Isn't that something? Boaz, the top, blesses the bottom, okay? He knows Ruth is forsaken in marriage, in other words, what I'm saying is, Boaz knows Ruth's story, that she could have stayed in Moab and remarried. But no, he not only respects the fact that Ruth had followed Naomi, he sees this as a high aspiration that she did what she did. to leave everything behind and help Naomi. Verse 13, if you go on a little bit farther, I'll read that. It says, she responded, may I continue to find favor in your sight? Now, this is, again, Ruth talking to Boaz. May I continue to find favor on your sight, sir, since you've been comforting me and you have spoken graciously to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants. So Ruth acknowledges Boaz consoling words. She says, he spoke from the heart. Certain versions will say that. Boaz spoke from the heart. Boaz, remember, is powerful, but yet he's tender. He's at the top, but he's respecting the bottom. He sees this. He's protecting Ruth. He sees that she's from another country, and so much. So in the end, Boaz and Ruth reverse Naomi's cynical view of God. And we see these cycles of this Hesed love come through. So in other words, Boaz and Ruth are connecting on a level. Boaz lifts Ruth up on a spiritual level. He's reaching down for her. And Ruth is responding. And Naomi is cynical about God. How can she not be when her husband and her 2 sons have died? Right? And so what's happening is now there becomes a transformation in Naomi's life because of Ruth and because of Boaz. We see this cycle of Hesed. Boaz performs this love Hesed to Ruth because of Ruth's virtue. He sees that she's a virtuous woman. Okay. And Ruth reciprocates this love back to Boaz because Boaz is identified as a valor character in this book. He is high, but he's respectable by the people. He leaves more for the women to glean or the men to glean, whatever. And he asked even to throw more out. Remember that? We don't have to go there. We don't have time to do it, but he knows Ruth's situation and he wants to give her more food. That is Boaz's heart. He spoke from the heart, like it said in verse 13. So because of this, Naomi sees this selflessness love between the two. This Hesed love is a selfless love. And she starts to restore, God is starting to restore her picture of God himself because of this interaction. In chapter 2, he authorizes the gleaners to drop. Now, in Hebrew, this is 30 pounds of extra barley, 30 pounds for Ruth to glean. That's a lot. 30 pounds of barley. In chapter 3, he gives her 60 pounds of barley. So Naomi's coming home like 60 pounds. I mean, can you imagine carrying a sack of 30 or 60 pounds? And this is what I got today. So Boaz is really displaying his love towards Ruth. And Naomi is seeing this. Let's read chapter 2, verse 20 in the book of Ruth. Naomi replied, may the one who hasn't abandoned his gracious love to the living or to the dead be blessed by the Lord. Naomi added, this man is closely related to us, our related Redeemer, as a matter of fact. So she is seeing that the blessed be the Lord who has not left his kindness. His Hesed love is that word kindness in the King James. I should have read the King James. Blessed be the Lord who has not left his Hesed love to the living, which is Ruth, and the dead, Naomi. Naomi's seeing that she is dead. Living is Ruth. She's called the living, and she's seeing that this Hesed love from Boaz. So by using his power for love, Boaz has drawn down help for the others, for the poor. Humility draws him down, and yet Ruth responds. And because of this, we see Boaz and Ruth get closer. So in chapter 2, verse 9, Boaz protects Ruth from other men. Okay, who would do that in the time of Judges? Okay. In chapter 3, verse 11, Boaz is smitten of Ruth's bravery and courage. I won't have to get into that, but he is like, wow. He's just, and Boaz breaks these cultural boundaries by eating with a woman and serving her. So in chapter 3, we don't go through it because we don't have time. Boaz actually eats with Ruth. Now, it was very uncommon that a clan leader would eat with the lowest level, let alone a woman. Okay. let alone women. Men and women were separated during those times of the judges. They wouldn't be with each other. So the whole of this, and if you read even closer, Boaz is serving Ruth. In traditional culture, again, he would lose his dignity by doing that, but he sees Hesed love, and he's motivated by, there's no risk in it for me, he says. This is what I'm going to do because this is who I am. I love. So that is Boaz's real test of character, is how he treats women, or a woman, especially Ruth. And the story goes on that this Hesed love evokes love in others as it draws you in. More people respect Boaz in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem at the time, because of how he reacted to Ruth. More people respect Naomi because of Ruth's love towards Naomi. Do you see? This is all going this way. It's going up. It's not being more cynical about God. It's not being saying, I got problems in my life. This always happens to me. Yeah, that's how Naomi felt. But Boaz and Ruth just elevated her out of that situation. And when Ruth first met Boaz, she called herself a Shipka. Okay, so Shipka in Hebrew is a slave girl. That's what she says. I am a Shipka. I'm a slave girl. The second time, though, in chapter 3, verse 9, Ruth calls herself Ahama, which means a handmaid, which means that basically someone who's eligible for marriage. So when she first meets Boaz, I'm a slave girl, servant girl, right? Now she this view of Boaz, she elevates, she calls something different. And that difference is now a handmaid who's eligible for marriage. So Boaz is in love. In chapter 3, verse 10, it says, you have this Hesed love, again, greater than the first. In other words, he's saying, you're a handmaid. You're loving me. This kindness, this Hesed love, you've made greater than the first being, I am a slave girl. Why? Because one, Ruth didn't go after young men for husbands, and Boaz picked that up. I'm sure there were some other good-looking guys, and she wasn't just there to a lot of these single women at the time were looking for men to be married. Why? Because women didn't have any respect in that time. You didn't have an inheritance from your parents. You couldn't legally get one, even as an Israelite. So she's all by herself. And she wasn't looking for a husband necessarily. And the second thing is Boaz saw that Ruth put this Hesed love before her own interests of stature, beauty, or wealth. So in other words, Ruth is only concerned about Naomi's life. She's not concerned about how beautiful she looks. She's not concerned about her status. Oh, I'm just at the bottom. I'm going to try to work myself up. Now, she's not worried about that. Boaz picks that up at that time. And in chapter 3, verse 11, Boaz will do all he can because of her virtuous character. Let's take a look at that. Chapter 3 of Ruth, verse 11. And this is the ISB. It says, don't be afraid. This is Boaz speaking to Ruth. Don't be afraid, my daughter. I'll do for you everything that you have asked, since all of my people in town are aware that you're a virtuous woman. Isn't that beautiful? So Boaz picks this up, and this dance of Hesed love just becomes stronger and stronger. Boaz is willing to do everything. So obviously, if he's there was other women, but this woman stood out. This Moabite woman stood out. So Boaz was caught up into this Hesed love of Ruth because of her courage and her virtue. Now, Ruth caught up to Boaz. She was caught up because of his man of integrity and his tenderheartedness to reach the slave girl, to reach down that low. And she's impressed that she would be treated with such kindness as an alien. You see where Jesus comes in? He came down to this earth and we are the real aliens. All right. We were been separated by sin from God. So what's happening is that Ruth's story is this picture of Christ and his bride. Christ being Boaz, the bride being Ruth. And we see this formulate. Naomi was resurrected because of this. She sees this and her hope is resurrection, in that there is hope for me. So this skewed picture that Naomi had of God, because her husband died, her two sons died, she just didn't want probably to do anything with God anymore, is totally restored because of this picture of Ruth and Boaz. And the whole point of this is that when love pursues its object, self disappears and pride is eliminated. Isn't that beautiful? So that's the picture of God. That's why the book of Ruth is in here. So we have this correct picture of God, doesn't despite my situation or the consequences I did for something. It's really dependent upon God's love towards me and trying to get that infused so I can love others, like this Boaz and Ruth story. So in chapter 4, Boaz marries Ruth. In the Bethlehem, there was a Bethlehemite woman says this to Naomi. This is, I'm not sure where it is in the last chapter, but she says this: "The Lord be blessed, who has not left you today without a kinsman redeemer, that his character will be revealed in Israel. He is the restorer of life, because your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better than 7 sons." And so for a woman to say that during the time of Judges, sons were everything, they're the heirs, they're the inheritance, they provided the food but here is a woman saying to Naomi that Ruth is better than 7 sons. And Ruth has a son, and you know what his name was? Obed. Sound familiar? Grandfather of David. So Obed means this in Hebrew: Naomi has a son. Isn't that beautiful? So the whole idea of Ruth's son is named Obed because they saw that Naomi's 2 sons died. Now Naomi has a son. It's beautiful. Ellen White says this in the Conflict Ages, the first paragraph. She says that God is love. If you read the Conflict of the Ages, Patriarchs, Prophets, first, she defines God as love in that first paragraph. Guess what the last paragraph talks about? And which is the great controversy. God's love is restored. So it's this whole picture of how we view God. And love is in the center of it. And it took 2 characters, Boaz and Ruth, to define that for us on a human level. And this is the whole picture of God that we need repeated in our lives. Actually, what it means is to incorporate God's life. Christ in you, Colossians 1:27, is the hope of glory, Paul says. It's only Christ in me. It's bringing that love in me that I can love others. I can't love others. How can you love your enemy in Matthew 5? It's impossible. So this is the beautiful story that Ruth has contributed to the Old Testament. It's really putting a proper picture of God in place about the love of God and how Ruth and Boaz describe the bridegroom and the bride. Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we just thank you for this beautiful picture of Ruth. 4 chapters in a book of the Old Testament that has 39 books in it with chapters galore, but this really pinpoints how if we become cynical of our picture towards you, no matter what the situation, no matter what the consequence, no matter what has been done, that we can look at this Hesed love that looks beyond that and provides hope. And we have this story here in the book of Ruth to prove that out. Lord, we just thank you for all that you provide in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let us all stand and sing our closing song, hymn number 186, I Found a Friend. I found a friend, oh, such a friend. He loved me, ne'er I know him. He drew me with the cords of love, and thou hast bound me to him. And round my heart still closely twine those ties which not once ever, for I